intelligence might seem like a blessing, but for the Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza, it was the very thing that led to his isolation. At age 23, he faced the ultimate choice: maintain his brilliant philosophical ideas and face complete excommunication from his community, or conform to traditional thinking and maintain his social connections. He chose truth over comfort, and that decision would change his life forever. Imagine living in Amsterdam in 1656. The city was booming with trade and new ideas, but Spinoza's Jewish community was tight-knit and traditional. Young Spinoza was already making waves, not because he was loud or rebellious, but because he asked questions that made people uncomfortable. During religious discussions, while others nodded along, Spinoza would raise his hand and ask, "But how do we know God isn't actually nature itself?" Or, "What if our ancient texts were written by regular people, not prophets?" These weren't just random thoughts. Spinoza had spent countless nights reading not just religious texts, but also new scientific discoveries. He learned about planets, mathematics, and the latest philosophical ideas. But sharing these thoughts came at a terrible price. First, the whispers started. Parents warned their children to stay away from him. Shop owners would serve him last. His own family began to distance themselves. Then came July 27, 1656, a day that would have broken most people. Picture this: the synagogue is packed, the air thick with tension. Black candles are lit, and the community's leaders read out their verdict. They called Spinoza a danger to the faith and listed his horrible heresies. The punishment? Complete excommunication. No one was allowed to talk to him, do business with him, or even stand within 6 feet of him. They even cursed him with ancient Hebrew curses. Most people would have broken down, apologized, and begged to be accepted back. Not Spinoza. Instead of crying or pleading, he simply said, "This only forces me to do what I would have done anyway." He walked out of that synagogue, leaving behind everything he knew: his family, his business connections, and his entire social world. He chose the path of intelligence over acceptance, of truth over comfort. This isn't just some dusty historical story. Right now, in offices, schools, and social gatherings across the world, smart people face similar choices. Maybe not as dramatic as Spinoza's, but just as real. Speak up with that innovative idea and risk being labeled as difficult? Point out the flaw in the group's thinking and become the outsider? Or stay quiet, nod along, and maintain those comfortable social connections? Spinoza's story teaches us something crucial about intelligence. Sometimes, the price of seeing what others can't see is walking a path others won't walk. But as we'll discover through his life, this path, though lonely, led him to become one of history's most influential thinkers. And maybe, just maybe, being alone isn't the worst thing that can happen to a smart person. Sometimes it's the very thing that sets them free. When you think deeply about things, you start seeing problems that others don't, and this can be incredibly lonely. Take Spinoza's daily life after his excommunication. He moved to a small room in The Hague, where he spent his days grinding lenses for telescopes to make a living. But while his hands worked with glass, his mind worked on questions that would shake the foundations of European thought. One day, a visitor found him completely absorbed in watching spiders fight. Spinoza had set up elaborate webs in his room and would spend hours observing these battles. When asked why, he explained that understanding nature's patterns, even in spider fights, could teach us more about life than all our human-made rules. His neighbors thought he was crazy. Who spends their time watching spiders? But these observations led him to insights about natural behavior that scientists wouldn't confirm for centuries. This is the first burden of intelligence. You notice patterns that others miss, and it can make you seem strange. Think about someone like Nikola Tesla, who could visualize his inventions so perfectly in his mind that he rarely needed to draw blueprints. His colleagues thought he was losing it when he claimed he could split the earth like an apple. But his deep understanding of electricity was so far beyond his time that we're still catching up to some of his ideas today. But here's where it gets really interesting and painful. Smart people often can't unsee what they've noticed. Imagine being in a meeting where everyone is excited about a new project, but you've spotted 3 major flaws in the plan. You could stay quiet and maintain harmony, but your mind won't let you rest. This happened to Spinoza constantly. When religious leaders claimed miracles proved God's direct intervention, he couldn't help but point out that this view of God was too small, too human-like. He saw God in the mathematical patterns of the universe itself, a view that made him even more isolated. The real trouble comes when you try to explain what you see. Spinoza once wrote to a friend, "When I explain my ideas, people either get angry or think I'm speaking in riddles." This wasn't because he was trying to be difficult. It's like trying to explain color to someone who's only seen in black and white. The gap in perception makes communication almost impossible. Modern research has found that people with higher intelligence often struggle with what psychologists call the curse of knowledge. Once you understand something deeply, it becomes hard to remember what it was like not to understand it. This makes it incredibly difficult to connect with others who don't share your level of understanding. It's not about being better, it's about being different in a way that creates natural barriers to connection. But perhaps the heaviest burden is the moral one. When you see problems clearly, you often feel obligated to solve them. Spinoza saw how fear and superstition were holding people back from true understanding, and he felt compelled to write about it, even though he knew it would only increase his isolation. This same pattern repeats today. The whistleblower who can't ignore corruption, the scientist who challenges popular but wrong beliefs, the employee who points out critical flaws in a beloved project. Their intelligence becomes a moral burden, forcing them to choose between comfortable silence and lonely truth. You might think being super smart means you'd have endless fascinating conversations, but Spinoza's life shows us something different. Living in his tiny rented room in The Hague, Spinoza had a strange daily routine that perfectly captures why intelligent people often end up alone. In the morning, he'd grind his lenses, detailed, precise work that most people found boring. But while doing this simple task, his mind would explore complex ideas about human nature and God. When customers came to buy his lenses, they'd sometimes try to chat, but their eyes would glaze over as soon as he excitedly shared his latest philosophical insights. This wasn't just Spinoza being socially awkward. His mind was literally operating in a different realm. While his neighbors worried about the price of bread or the latest town gossip, he was wrestling with questions like, is free will real, and what if God and nature are the same thing? Imagine trying to talk about quantum physics at a party where everyone else is discussing the weather. That's what everyday conversations felt like for him. And here's something fascinating about Spinoza that most people don't know. He actually tried to build friendships. He joined a small group of intellectual friends called the collegians. They would meet regularly to discuss ideas, but even there, Spinoza often found himself lonely. Why? Because while others debated standard religious interpretations, he was already 10 steps ahead, questioning whether traditional religion made any sense at all. It's like being the only person who's seen the end of a movie in a room full of people still guessing the plot. This problem gets even worse in our modern world. Studies have shown that highly intelligent people often have interests that only 2 to 5% of the population share. Think about that. If you're fascinated by theoretical physics, abstract philosophy, or complex mathematical patterns, you might only find 1 person in 50 who truly gets excited about the same things. Spinoza faced this exact issue. While most people in 1600s Amsterdam were interested in practical matters of trade and religion, he was developing ideas about psychology and human behavior that wouldn't become mainstream for another 300 years. Let's look at a day in Spinoza's life that perfectly shows this problem. One afternoon, a famous philosopher named Leibniz came to visit him. Finally, you might think, Spinoza would have someone to really talk to, but even this meeting proved challenging. While Leibniz wanted to discuss safe, acceptable philosophical ideas, Spinoza kept pushing toward more radical thoughts about freedom and religion. The conversation became so intense that Leibniz later admitted he had to hold back from fully engaging. He was worried about his reputation just from talking to Spinoza. This highlights another crucial point. Smart people often have to dumb down their interests to maintain social connections. Spinoza wrote his most radical ideas in private letters and kept his published works more moderate. Modern research shows this pattern continues today. Highly intelligent people often report having to maintain 2 separate conversation styles, one for their deep interests and another for everyday social interaction. This constant switching becomes exhausting, and many eventually choose solitude over the energy drain of maintaining these dual personalities. But perhaps the most painful part is the speed of thought. Spinoza's letters show him constantly jumping ahead in conversations, making connections others couldn't follow. This isn't showing off. It's just how his mind worked. Today, we know that differences in processing speed can make conversations frustrating for both parties. When you're 10 steps ahead in a conversation, waiting for others to catch up can feel like watching a video in slow motion. Eventually, many intelligent people choose solitude simply because it allows their minds to run at their natural pace. What most people don't know about Spinoza is that he actually grew to love his solitude. After being kicked out of his community, he moved to a small room that most would find depressing, but in his letters, he wrote something surprising. "I have everything I need in this room, my books, my tools, and most importantly, the freedom to think." Here's a fascinating detail about his daily life. Spinoza kept a spider in a little box on his desk. When asked why, he said watching the spider build its web taught him more about nature's perfection than all the arguments of philosophers. While others saw a lonely man playing with bugs, he was discovering profound truths about life. This is when he realized something crucial. Being alone isn't the same as being lonely. In fact, Spinoza's most productive and peaceful years were his solitary ones. He developed a daily routine that would seem bizarre to most people. He'd wake up early, spend hours grinding lenses, his day job, and then devote the rest of his time to writing and thinking. His meals were simple, sometimes just bread and milk. To others, this looked like a sad, isolated life. But Spinoza was experiencing what psychologists now call productive solitude. Let me share a little-known story that perfectly captures this. One day, a group of well-meaning friends tried to rescue Spinoza from his solitary life. They offered him a generous pension and a position at a university. Most people would jump at this chance for social status and connection. But Spinoza's response shocked everyone. He said, "Nature is satisfied with little, and when she is satisfied, I am also satisfied." He turned down the offer, choosing his simple, solitary life over social recognition. This wasn't just stubbornness. Spinoza had discovered something that modern research now confirms. Intelligent people often need more time alone to process their complex thoughts. He wrote in one letter, "In solitude, I can follow my thoughts to their natural conclusion without worrying about offending anyone or being interrupted midstream." Think about this incredible detail. After his excommunication, Spinoza could have moved to any major European city where his ideas would have been welcome. Instead, he chose to stay in the Netherlands, living just far enough from his old community to be independent, but close enough to remind himself of the price of conformity. He wasn't running away. He was standing his ground in solitude. The real breakthrough came when Spinoza realized that his solitude was actually a form of freedom. He wrote, "The more I learned to be sufficient unto myself, the closer I grew to understanding the nature of things." This wasn't just philosophical talk. He had discovered what many intelligent people eventually learn. When you stop fighting against your natural need for solitude and embrace it, life actually becomes richer, not poorer. In his final years, Spinoza made an observation that perfectly sums up this principle. He noted that people who need constant company are like cripples needing crutches, while those who can embrace solitude have learned to walk freely. It's not that he never enjoyed company. He maintained correspondence with brilliant minds across Europe. But he had learned that true peace comes from being comfortable in your own intellectual space, even if that space is one that few others can enter. The idea that brilliant minds often walk alone isn't unique to Spinoza. Let me share something fascinating about Nikola Tesla that most people don't know. In his later years, Tesla developed such an intense need for solitude that he would only eat alone in his hotel room, requiring exactly 18 napkins to clean his dining space. People called him crazy, but during these solitary meals, he would visualize his inventions so perfectly that he could test them in his mind for weeks before building anything. But here's where it gets really interesting. There's a hidden pattern across history of great thinkers finding power in solitude. Let me tell you about Kierkegaard. another philosopher who lived 2 centuries after Spinoza. Despite being engaged to a woman he deeply loved, he broke off the engagement because he knew his mind needed solitude to work. In his private journals, he wrote something that eerily echoes Spinoza's experience. "People understand me so little that they don't even understand when I complain of being misunderstood." This brings us to a remarkable story about Isaac Newton. During the Great Plague of 1665, when his university shut down, Newton was forced into solitude for 2 years. Most people would have seen this as a disaster, but during this lonely time, he developed calculus, his theories of gravity, and his groundbreaking work on optics. Here's the kicker. When asked how he made such amazing discoveries, Newton said, "By thinking about it all the time." And it's not just Western thinkers. In ancient China, the philosopher Zhuangzi wrote about a fascinating concept called sitting in forgetfulness. He described how true understanding only comes when you're willing to sit alone and forget about social expectations. He told a story about a deformed man who was so at peace with his solitude that kings came to learn from him. A perfect parallel to how people eventually sought out Spinoza's wisdom despite his social exile. The pattern continues with Emily Dickinson, one of America's greatest poets. Most people don't know this, but in her later years, she rarely left her room and spoke to visitors through a door. People thought she was just eccentric, but during this intense solitude, she wrote nearly 1,800 poems that would revolutionize poetry. She once wrote in a letter, "The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door." It's almost like she was channeling Spinoza's spirit. Even Einstein, who, unlike Spinoza, maintained some social connections, insisted on long periods of solitude. There's a lesser-known story about him taking walks alone for hours during his time at Princeton. When concerned colleagues suggested he take an assistant to help with his work, he replied, "I am my own assistant." He understood, just like Spinoza, that some thoughts can only develop in solitude. What makes this historical pattern so powerful is that these thinkers didn't just tolerate their solitude. They transformed it into a source of strength. They showed that what looks like isolation from the outside might actually be intense connection with deeper truths. On the inside, this is exactly what Spinoza discovered in his small room, watching his spider and grinding his lenses, while his mind explored the universe. Let me share something powerful that Spinoza wrote in his final years. "All things excellent are as difficult as they are rare." He wasn't just talking about philosophy. He was talking about finding your own path to happiness, even when that path looks strange to others. But how do we actually use this wisdom in our modern world? Here's a fascinating detail from Spinoza's life that most people miss. Despite his isolation, he maintained a wide network of correspondence with other thinkers across Europe. He was alone, but not completely cut off. This teaches us something crucial. Intelligence doesn't have to mean total isolation. Even in his tiny room, Spinoza found ways to connect with like minds through letters. Today, we have even more options. Think about this. Spinoza spent years grinding lenses to make a living while developing his ideas. He didn't need a prestigious university position or social status to do his best thinking. This has a powerful application for modern life. You don't need to choose between being smart and having a normal life. You just need to find your own balance, your own lens-grinding work that gives you the freedom to think deeply. Let me share a practical secret that Spinoza discovered. He learned to be selective about his social interactions. When visitors came to his room, he didn't reject them all. Instead, he welcomed those who genuinely wanted to understand and discuss ideas, while politely limiting time with those who just wanted to argue or gossip. This is crucial. It's not about being completely alone. It's about being intentional with your social energy. Here's something most people don't realize about Spinoza's life. He was actually happier after finding his solitude than he was trying to fit in with his community. His letters from this period show a man at peace with himself, free from the constant tension of trying to appear normal. This teaches us that sometimes accepting your difference, your need for space, your complex thoughts, your unusual interests, can bring more happiness than endlessly trying to fit in. But perhaps the most important lesson comes from how Spinoza ended his days. Despite being offered prestigious positions and chances to rejoin society, he chose to stay true to his nature. He died relatively young at 44, but he died satisfied. His last words weren't about regret for his solitude. They were focused on the ideas he was still developing. This teaches us something profound. Success isn't about forcing yourself to be more social or less intelligent. It's about finding the courage to live authentically. Remember this, Spinoza wasn't just smart. He was brave enough to be smart in his own way. He showed us that intelligence doesn't have to be a curse that condemns you to loneliness. Instead, it can be a path to a different kind of fulfillment, one where solitude becomes not a prison, but a garden where your mind can truly flourish. As Spinoza himself wrote, "I have strived not to laugh at human actions, not to weep at them, not to hate them, but to understand them." Perhaps this is the real key, not to fight against our nature, whether it leads us to solitude or society, but to understand it, accept it, and find our own unique way to thrive. End your script with this powerful thought. Sometimes, being alone isn't a failure to connect with others. It's succeeding at connecting with yourself. And in that connection, like Spinoza discovered, you might find more richness than in 1,000 shallow relationships.